Very, very warm welcome, Alon, to this meeting. The 4Ds, dreamers, doers, designers, and doubters. And the doubters are very special. And we this as we chatted before, Alon, we're going to have a conversation. I would by the also like to thank you a lot, Yahia, to put us in contact. As I understand, you have been student to Alon, right?
My pleasure.
Yes, and you're going to be presenting yourself later, but you're a dean of École de Ponts, right, in France, business
Yes.
school, and CU professor, and one of the areas you specialize is, and that's the topic of today is complexity. That, as you know, is very warm to the heart of these communities, its group, because we're looking very much at the meta crisis and all these areas that are complex by nature, right? So looking very much forward, great discussion, and welcome, Cecilia. Yes, and
Thank you.
hello, hello. And what we will do is that we have two moderators facilitating the session, Peter, that you also met before, and Kazi. So, Kazi, you're going to look especially on the chat because we can have questions at any time, right? So without further ado, maybe just let me introduce you, Peter, before you leave the word to Alon.
Yes, sorry. So, hello everybody, and hello Alan. I'm very much looking forward to moderate this session together with you and Casimir and the rest as well. So, when we say we're moderating a session, it's basically just creating an order in the terms of questions. It's not that we're deciding anything important here or whom gets to speak or anything. Raise your hand. I suppose, Alan, that you think it's okay if people raise your hand even while you're doing your
We lost you, Peter.
presentation?
Peter, we lost your sound, or at least I did.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened here.
Yep, you're back. Now it's
now
it's good.
Okay. So I don't know how much of that got through, but when I say I'm a moderator together with Casimir, it doesn't mean that we decide whom gets to talk. Raise your hand whenever you have a question, and I assume also, Alon, that you are okay also with maybe people raising hands during the main presentation. But if you can, guys, refrain and ask your questions afterwards, because the first part is Alan's presentation, and then we'll have a back and forth. So that's usually the format for today.
All right, should we dive in?
Yes, the stage is yours, Alan. Take it away.
All right. So I'll just give you a quick idea. I've prepared about 20 slides, including this one, so a little bit less. From concept to reality on the decoding complexity, a few words just to make sure we're aligned on the basics, and some food for thought along the way. Part one is mostly looking at the concept of complexity in different ways. You can see I've taken the Mobius loop as the metaphor for complexity. You don't know which side you're looking at. There's no start, there's no end. I thought it was a good visual for the idea. So part one is there. I've tried to make it structured in kind of amenable to a conversation. So don't hesitate to raise hands or unmute and ask questions if you have that urge. Then I'll do a pause after part one, which is the concept for discussion. And then there's a second part, which is only like 4 or 5 slides, which is like the way forward. Like, okay, now that we understand this notion of complexity, what the hell do we do with it? That will be part two, and then again, hopefully open that up to discussion. So I'll try to respect the time so that we have more time to discuss and hear less of myself. So 3 words to maybe just describe myself, my 3-word bio. is innovation, technology, and impact, trying to look at the convergence between the three. I think you can easily understand where complexity comes into the mix. Anything that has to do with innovation, emerging technologies, and impact, whether it's climate or sustainability or new energies, is definitely fertile terrain for complexity to emerge. Enough about me. So just taking thinking of complexity as not a one idea, but as a kind of like a spectrum. You can take it and kind of think about problems, challenges, systems, whatever it may be, but starting from easy, moving to hard, to complicated, to complex, and then chaotic. Sometimes the Kunvins and others add a disorder after chaotic, so there's something even beyond chaotic, depending on who you ask. And within that kind of spectrum, there's a little bit of parasites. There's the notion of overcomplicated that fits somewhere probably between the notion of complicated and complex on the one hand, and then the subject that I know all of you are very interested in, which is the meta crisis, which kind of comes in somewhere between the complex and the chaotic and kind of sneaks in there, not really being clearly in one camp or the other. As we, just to kind of think about the difference between complicated and complex, if we want to put a dividing line somewhere, idea of like complicated, again, whether it's a problem, a solution, a system, a challenge, whatever it may be, the idea is that if it's complicated, you can break it down into parts and understand each part, kind of like a clock. There is a notion of predictability here. If you can know all of the parts, you can pretty much predict how they're going to work together. That predictability falls apart once we move to complex. Here we have, numerous interacting parts. What often happens is there are unpredictable behaviors that are emergent from that mix. Weather is an easy one to understand. Economics is another one. And even if you can understand the individual components, it doesn't mean you can predict how will they behave or actually understand how the sum of the parts actually, what qualities the sum of the parts will actually have. And so that's kind of complexity in a nutshell, and the difference between complicated. When we look at the overlap between the two, there's the notion of overcomplicated. A very good book by Samuel Arbesman, for anybody who's interested, with the same title. And basically the idea is this, we all are carrying a smartphone in our pockets. And even though we can probably understand how a GPS works or a digital camera works, but basically there's no one on the planet that understands all of the components that go into a smartphone. And yet we use this technology every day. And it's wonderful on the one hand because it democratizes the use of the technology. But on the other hand, it's kind of, we accept that opacity. We accept to use this technology regularly in our professional, personal lives and everything in between, leisure as well, even though we don't really understand how all of the parts come together. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but it leads us down potentially a slippery slope. Another example of overcomplicated that's interesting to think about, especially in today's context, and when we talk about meta crises, you'll see why as well, is the supply chain of a modern laptop. So this is a little bit hard to see with the darker background, but basically you can see arrows all around the world, product nodes and sourcing and primary materials, secondary materials, and the rest. And basically, a simple laptop. So we talked about the smartphone. Most of us are also working on a laptop. That is a level of globalization that it's complicated, even though it can appear complex. You can actually take it apart and understand where each element comes from, and you can kind of guess the qualities of a computer based on this. But today, just think about the challenge of, trying to reverse globalization. deglobalize the supply chain. The challenging today, if we're thinking the supply chains, can we reconfigure supply chains? Can we greenify supply chains? And even worse, let's try to measure for ESG scope 3 of our supply chains. You see something like this and you realize what a risible attempt that is. We are just, where we can try, and it would be a noble attempt, but really trying to measure the impact and the environmental impact of even just a laptop that we all use seems to be a fool's errand. And yet the legislators, especially in Europe, are going in that direction of saying we should at least try. But you can see how this can take a lifetime. The trap of overcomplication. Just like the first one is, it's kind of we have an arrogance of wanting to understand, and then there's the humility of saying, all right, I give up. We're at the limits of comprehension on a lot of the tools that are key to our daily life and even to our profession. The second part, and this is important to understand, is that we accept increasing opacity in how our key technologies work. So a technology is anything that helps humans accomplish tasks. And increasingly, they're digital or they're hardware that's at the intersection of software and digital. If we go down the slippery slope of accepting opacity, we accept as well that all of these technologies accumulate extra layers of complexity. And again, we said complexity means that there are going to be emergent qualities that we can't guess ahead of time. And so, fast forward to today, everybody has AI on their lips, but what we create and we accept to create by accepting this opacity that comes with overcomplicated are systems that are opaque, unpredictable, and potentially uncontrollable. And so here is the crux. We haven't even gotten into complexity yet. And already you can see how just accepting overcomplicated is a principle in our lives. We're already on a path towards unpredictable, uncontrollable systems. And again, AI and with the many thinkers today or pundits that are saying this system will quickly get out of control, this reflects a little bit of that kind of thinking. So now we get to the word complex and complexity. Basically, the origin, it's always interesting to look at etymology, is interwoven or entwined. All right? So quite simple. In the evolution of the use complexity, we went from physical entanglement, from, basically threads or a carpet that's being woven, to the interconnectedness of systems and systemic interconnectedness. And today, the more modern usage is all of these intricate systems with emergent properties. And economy being one of the best there. And now again, AI gaining a lot of tension and attention in regards to emergence. So all of that to say that we still don't know how to unscramble eggs. And one of the things that I'll share with you is this idea for me that complexity is kind of like the second law of thermodynamics. I don't know if you guys remember the entropy, the law of second law of thermodynamics, which basically is saying entropy, any system over time only gets more complicated. It never gets simpler. And it's by design, I guess, of our natural laws of physics, and it's inevitable. So complexity seems to be our destiny on this planet, in the physical system that we know. And, we resist it so much, and yet we've learned about it since we were 10 years old. In our first course in physics was just that. And the idea of complexity, seeing it as scrambled eggs, as if the eggs are getting more and more scrambled the more we advance. And instead of resisting that, accepting that it's a natural law that governs everything else that we experience in life. This leads to an increasingly, I'd say, universal phenomenon, in which I call it the corporate complexity denial syndrome, CCDS. But there's this kind of failure to acknowledge or to deliberately ignore the inherent complexity within a company's operational environment, the systems or the challenges they're facing. And there's a lot of good reasons to do that, but I think you can quickly see why this could be a problem. What happens when you deny complexity is you have a bias to oversimplification. You start treating complex adaptive issues as if they were technical problems. Another thing you do is you generate an over-reliance on data, data-driven decision-making, quantitative metrics, and you start neglecting qualitative insights and the unpredictability that's inherent in the complex systems. So, basically it's, if I have enough data, I can make a good plan. Business plan, operating plan, action plan, whatever it may be. And I don't really plan to adapt because I'm not accepting the inherent complexity. So some of the systems here, I think you can see this today. And again, AI is one of the drivers of this. There's an illusion here that if we have better data, and I don't know if you saw this, OpenAI, and I think it was the Hinton who won the Nobel Prize with DeepMind. He said basically the only problem holding back AI today is more and better data. And so, this is, our top minds are saying the problem is not enough data, instead of saying we have to think about complexity rather than about data. This notion of an illusion of control, starting with the board's governance, they have a very tough time embracing complexity. And they say, yeah, we had COVID, we're in a crisis, we have no idea when the supply chains will open up again, but give me your forecast for next year, and I want it to be 95% certain. And so, obviously, that's impossible. Nobody has a crystal ball. But the illusion of control is part of this. And beyond that, what I call the illusion of informed action. You make a decision based on data, and so you think that this must be a good decision. And so this illusion of informed action is quite interesting. I don't know if, the interesting thing about management, and this is very much a Mintzberg idea, so to double click on something you guys have already probably thought about, but top managers, CEOs, the board, they are paid to make decisions under uncertainty. Anybody who makes decisions with perfect certainty is probably a frontline employee with rule-based approach to making decisions. Those who need to make decisions with less than perfect information are the CEOs. And today they're denying that role and saying, no, 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 I can also make decisions with perfect certainty. Just give me more data. Let the model run the numbers. And so the final point, and this is actually something I'm sure you see in Sweden, we definitely see it in France, in Germany, in Spain. I'd also say that we see this in Morocco and elsewhere. Anywhere there's a strong engineering kind of education system, and where a lot of top management have managerial background, engineering backgrounds, you have a really strong technical bias. That basically everything can be reduced to a technical bias. I'm an engineer. I can model anything. Just give me the right data and enough data. And so all of these create a situation which, for example, in the adaptive leadership arena, they say the biggest error that anybody can make in a leadership position is to confuse adaptive challenges with technological challenges. And I think we've all seen many areas in which we've done this, climate change maybe being the most recent. So if we stay with the technical versus adaptive lens, so when you talk about technical challenges, basically there's a clear problem definition. We have known solutions. We can find the experts to solve them, usually PhDs that can simulate, model anything. And it's pretty quick to implement because we know how to solve the problem. The adaptive challenge, which is much more common than we accept, uh, just defining the problem is tough. These are ambiguous issues. If you think about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, how do you define the problem? It's ambiguous, and it depends on your perspective. There is no way to define the problem clearly and cleanly. It requires new approaches, new ways of thinking, new interdisciplinarity. It needs collective learning, and it needs time. It needs gradual behavior change. But since the corporates are in denial complexity, I don't want to give this time. I don't want to change behaviors. I don't want to try new approaches, and I can't deal with ambiguity. So what do? Let's just call it a technical problem. And what that creates is a whole slew of new problems because of this. We've misdiagnosed the nature of the problem already, so that can't be good. So we're going to put in place ineffective solutions because we're solving for the wrong problem. We create an immunity to change in a culture because we're not even facing the tough questions and not willing to have the tough conversations that adaptive challenges require. We're wasting resources, throwing good money after bad ideas, basically. And it creates a slew, again, of unintended consequences. We kick the can down the road. We can make better cars with less emissions, and we should move to diesel, and all of Europe moved to diesel engines. And then we all woke up one day and realized, oh shit, diesel pollutes. And more than we thought, and more than the automakers were telling us. So maybe we should find a more realistic solution to decarbonization and cleaning the air in our cities, just to give that example. Leading to the meta crisis, again, something that you've spoken about, but obviously it's the confluence of crises, which makes the common usual suspects of tools and even frameworks that we have very difficult to leverage in those kind of situations. And meta crises really embody the essence of complexity. A lot of interconnected factors interacting in unpredictable and emergent ways, and usually new ways from what we have seen before, which is a key part of it too, is we've never developed tools for this. We don't know what mindset to adapt. COVID-19 was a very good example. Climate change is a very good example. Even though we've known about it for 30 years, we're still now just coming, a lot of people still aren't, but let's say most of us are coming to realization that this is real, it's happening, and maybe we're reacting too late. But when you mix the two of those together and some of the conflicts that are going on, that brings us to like what Yuval Noah Harari said was like, World War II, everybody knows, was started by, an assassination in Austria. Every school child knows that's how World War II started, or World War One, and etc. We know the dates of when the world started, but he said that was the historians that pieced it together after the fact. He's saying maybe we're already in World War III and we just don't know it yet. There's hot conflicts around the planet, the U.S.-China, deflagration. And so potentially we're in World War III already and we just don't know it. If we're talking about the mother of all meta crises, think about a World War III scenario together with climate change and extreme weather conditions, and the complexity basically goes off the scale, potentially into chaos, which was the last factor there. So if we try to think about that a little bit, here I wanted to give you some food for thought. I think a lot of you know the Kuhnevin framework. For those who don't, it's an interesting outfit that's really thinking about how to deal with complexity. and they've created a pretty interesting framework for probing and sensing and adapting and in storing agility. And so that if you are interested in the subject, the Krunevin framework, which is easily downloaded, is something that's interesting to look at. But what I wanted to turn your attention to is the parallel with Howe and Strauss. I don't know if many of you are familiar with their work. The Fourth Turning is a book. I think it was Bill Clinton who really became enamored with this book before he became president. And that's how it got my attention. But very interesting study of generational cycles. And basically, he's identified 4 cycles. One is called the spring, the high era. So think about, post World War II, Europe, everything is blossoming, construction, reconstruction, peace once again among the nations. And then you go into the second turning, which is the awakening. Um, think about the 60s and the sexual revolution, the use of LSD and different kind of drugs and creativity and celebration of everybody's uniqueness. And then we get to the third turning, which is another generation. So each one of these turnings is about 20 to 25 years, according to Howe and Strauss. And it's kind of everything starts to unravel. It goes from celebrating uniqueness to being the me generation. It's individual over the family or over society, and kind of a degradation of values as a society. People start abandoning religion. There's less spirituality. And that leads us to the fourth turning, which is called the winter or the crisis era. Uh, and that's actually an era of destruction. If you think about today's political situation in Europe, the US, I would say in particular, um, you can see that this is all about tearing down the establishment as you know it, doing a reset on institutions. It's really about tabula rasa, and it's really, people saying, I don't know what I want, but I don't want this. And this is where you can see the complex and the chaotic emerging in a system which is almost feels global. It's like people want to tear down the system we have. I don't think anybody's happy with the UN. Nobody's happy with NATO. You look at the EU and its discontents. I'd say very few people are holding up the EU as a major success, even though I think it is a major success. But the political wins are obviously to critique rather than to glorify. And so you can really see this. And it's a generational move. And so beyond the complexity that we're talking about, there's also kind of, I think, a natural cycle that we're living in that is very naturally tending towards increased complexity and to what you have studied before, which was the meta crises. It seems like a perfect storm in terms of timing, but I don't think, and that's what I think the Howe and Strauss framework seems to indicate, that it's not by chance that we have arrived at this confluence of crises, uh, political, social. For me, it's crazy that all of the countries, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US, Australia, France, all of these countries that were built on the foundation of immigration are now calling immigrants the enemy. It's just such a radical change of values, but or that someone like Trump could seriously be reelected a second time as president, someone who clearly has no values, and his only true political project is to destroy the existing system. And so these are kind of the elected leaders that we've inherited and that we've elected, unfortunately, that are here to, uh, basically precipitate the fourth turning. And so I think the notion of complexity and even of chaos is something that we're going to have to manage very carefully in the years ahead. Hopefully, this fourth turning can turn quite quickly and we can start building again. But I think just like the second law of thermodynamics, which is inescapable for us, it feels like we're in something that has its own dynamic that needs to play out. And so with that, I will pause for discussion. And if there are any questions or comments, and then we can talk about what do we do with all this and where can we go. I
Thank you,
saw a lot
Alon.
of comments on the chat, but I
Yes,
can't follow
lots
the
of
chat.
lots of thoughts.
Björn.
Let me unmute first. So, hello. I have a background from before I went to Ericsson, etc., and started to deal with business and what's not, that I took a PhD in theoretical physics. And at that time, of course, that this was during the 80s, and complex system from a mathematical point of view, it was very, very important. Of course, everything we see around us, more or less, we are complex because it's so many different actors. So you can't really predict anything. You can't predict a drop of water, to be simple. But you can still do a lot of very close prediction due to the fact that you have the concept of metastability. And that means that you can't really see before anything changes, that you kind of disrupt and go to a new metastable system, that the system is complex before it happens, so to speak. Do you have any comment on that? Or does my thinking, is it correct or not? But I think metastability is as important as metacrisis to some extent.
Yeah. Well, I've looked at the complexity issue more from an economics standpoint than the mathematical one. And here too, it's like the notion of stable equilibrium. If you think about financial markets,
Yes.
Markets are 99% of the time stable.
Yes.
But the two times in the last 20 years where they were not stable, you move from, bell curve distribution to Brownian reality where non-correlated elements become correlated. And basically all of the rules as we know them no longer apply. Correlation, causation, everything, flies out of the window. And so, yes, for metastability, but it's just, and again, since you've studied complexity, you know this, the complexity guys in Santa Fe have, the interesting basic model that they do on sand castles and how, when do they, the longer they stay stable, the bigger the fall when they crash.
Exactly.
And so I'd say there's an illusion of stability. If you think about the real estate markets going up for 30 years and then all of a sudden precipitous crash. Today, China is going through the same thing, 30-year growth and now deep crisis. So the metastability, yes, but it's also a double-edged sword that the longer we enjoy stability, the worse the crisis is that we have to face afterward. Like the regression to the mean on suffering is such that I think yes, for the principle of metastability, but we have to be wary of confusing stability with normalcy.
That was more or less my point. I maybe didn't express it correctly, but I totally agree with you that maybe a little bit of the illusion of stability is something that I think is very, very dangerous. That was essentially what I meant.
Thank you. I think, Mayanne, you're up next.
Thank you. Yes, I'm new to this group. I'm not an engineer.
Me too.
So I don't know if I'm, saying something that's not. Well, anyway, I was very interesting listening to you, and I've worked over years in the European Commission and for the last 9 years on migration. So of course your last statement here on blaming it, this kind of awful, I find it horrific, frankly, oversimplification that all our problems are due to the migrants. We see this, well, not only, in Sweden, until recently, Germany was one of the few member states of the EU that did not go along with this rhetoric. Now we have, there were killings, and since then there's been a complete turnaround. Also in France, it's changed radically. Well, I don't have to, tell you. I think we all are aware. But I'm just wondering, and this, of course, is part of the meta crisis. So I'm kind of very practically oriented. So what can we do? How can we get out of this narrative that I feel, very
Well,
disturbed? Yeah, thanks.
Well, I share completely your worry about migration. I'm on a board of directors that was actually, I was at the board right before this meeting started of Place Network in Paris that works on integrating migrants, and just how complicated it's become because funding has completely dried up. It went from being a popular item that was easily funded to being untouchable due to the political hot potato that it's become. But there was an amazing YouTube video. Actually, it's a TEDx talk, which is called something like "The Danger of the Single Story," and talking about if there's the narrative from one point of view, how we all buy into the narrative and have a very narrow view of a given subject, and so we need multiple narratives, and we need, for example, success stories. And it's the same thing, I think, with dealing with complexity. To bring it back to that, is like we need multiple lenses to look at whether it's crises or whatever it may be. For example, immigration policy, which is becoming increasingly complex with the undercurrents that go beyond the people who are actually migrating, and why they are migrating. And increasingly, they are displaced persons rather than people immigrating under normal conditions. We have to have multiple narratives, just like we need multiple lenses. And the plurivocity, which is actually a term of multiple voices, multiple narratives, is something that we have to make sure we encourage. I think a forum like this, which is inviting different speakers to talk about different subjects, is one way of ensuring plurivocity and not staying insular and keeping the conversation internal. But I think that's part of that. There's no magic bullet here. But for me personally, my approach is one integration success story at a time, and to tell those stories. That's what I feel like I can do at my level. Yeah, I think Juanes.
Thank you very much. Really, really fascinating. And I agree that one of the problems that we might have, it's because of these silos of information that are being created in almost everything that we do, then we cannot have multiple stories. We end up listening to the same story many times. And that's really, really a problem that definitely AI and algorithms and social media is not helping with. I'm going back to another of your comments, and I really like the part that it's what you mentioned, the corporate complexity denial, or complexity denial in general.
Yep.
And one of the things I like to see is try to connect as well neuroscience, and I've seen that there are two groups of people that are extremely good with neuroscience. The guys who have created a lot of tools for us to be completely addicted, and the hackers that basically convince us to click the link of something bad happening. So on the one side, we have a lot of these complexity denial symptoms that you mentioned, the illusions of control, the interest to build on top of a lot of data and all of that. On the other side, we have others who are helping us to make the decision that they want us to make. What is happening with boards now that they have this interest of making good decisions, but they are not making good decisions in general, and they have this illusion. Sometimes I feel that in boards they are just playing offices. They are not really making decisions. I don't know what's your perception of that, because I think that there's a lot being lost nowadays in boards decisions. And we can see that every day in news.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two strong forces in the planet working against innovation and change. The first are faculty of universities, tenured faculty, and the second are board members in the corporate boards. I think a big part of it is that there's a lack of understanding of the technologies and what they can do today. And as the pace of innovation accelerates, their response is to do more of what we did yesterday better. And they see that as innovation, and they confuse operational excellence as innovation. And so the good news is that all of these big companies are going to get mired in operational improvement or incremental innovation, which should leave more space for disruption, which means younger, innovative, more forward-thinking companies that can basically are free from these kind of boards for the most part, at least for a certain time. The problem is then if they get hoovered up by these big companies. And today, I think there's that third force against change are a lot of the big tech powerhouses that basically buy any new potential disruptors before they can disrupt. And so I think that what the Lisa Khan is doing in the United States, and what in Europe we try to do a little bit, is poking the bear of the big technology companies so that they level the playing field, is a key part of it. But if we get back to the board members, I think, again, we talk about the turnings, the fourth turnings. I think we need to turn to much younger boards and start to see a rotation. Basically, people who look like me, white men, older with gray hair, should be invited to leave the board and replaced with younger women and diversity, and people who are more probably technology, digital natives. And so I think and even just increasing the cognitive diversity in the boards would go a long way to improve their performance. But today, I think it's a real issue. And most of the big tech companies have created special governance structures so that they don't have to listen to their boards. Basically, they've neutralized the role of the board. So if it's Zuckerberg or it's Google or anywhere else, or it's Elon Musk buying his own company and then stacking it with board members who are friends or lackeys, I think that's a sign of the inefficiency of boards and that they don't play their role, is that they're gaming the system. And so I identify with what you're saying, is this is a real weak point in our overall business system today, even maybe in capitalism. And when we're dealing with complexity, it's probably even worse.
Thanks. With respect to time here, let's take Geraldo and Johan quick, and then you can move on to your next end of the presentation.
Sure.
I have two questions, and if you feel that it's more appropriate to take it later after the next presentation, so let me know. But the first question was about values, right? So working with leadership programs, executive development, so value-driven leadership for me always been a mantra, right? And just the other day in this group we have a coffee chat every Monday. So some of you recognize that we discussed, for instance, Elon Musk and all his achievements, right? It's one very concrete example that I felt exactly like you said. I'm one of the persons that nowadays I want anything but not this person, like say Trump, or was very excited by all the achievements from Elon Musk in the very beginning. But now I'm just so surprised with all the conspiracies, theories, and values. So I have difficult to, distinguish these two things. And we had a discussion in this group about values, right? So that was the first question. And I think it's very related to what kind of leadership and what kind of values we want as human beings, right? The second question was something that appeared in the chat, a discussion between me and Kazi, that I think you brought up, Kazi, that maybe we need to be more solution driven instead of looking at the root causes. Remember? And then
it has been Johan who mentioned that.
Yeah, and I don't
to
know,
build
Johan,
focus
but
on
as an engineer, and I mean, if you look, especially companies like McKinsey, so the root causes are so important, right? So we almost brainwashed to go deep into the root causes and do issue trees and things like that. So I guess that it depends on the circumstance we're talking about, right? But we shouldn't forget the root cause, because otherwise we try to find solutions to completely wrong things.
All right, Geraldo, I'm gonna just say to you that that is exactly complexity denial. That's exactly the an engineer thinking that we could do root cause analysis. The whole point of complexity is that there is no root cause. It's fuzzy logic and fuzzy problem. And that's the illusion of control, is that if we just give it enough time, data, thinking, analysis, we can figure out what the problem actually is. You know, and it's not. We have to let go of that root cause, which is really, I'd say it's a good reflex for serious thinkers. But in this case, it's the wrong reflex, which is why with complexity, like the usual tools just don't apply. And it's rather than root cause, it's having like an interdisciplinary discussion, kind of what you did, to say, let's think about this problem from multiple perspectives. And that's actually, it's a really good segue into the next part. So I can give a little bit of that. But on the values and leadership, I think it's very similar. I think there's the mindset, of values, value-based leadership, that like the values can be the operating system of how we address complexity. If we think about, the equality of chances or of opportunity, and we have like these values as guideposts and guiding principles as to how we respond to crises, meta crises, or different kind of complex situations, it can really help to make decisions on which solutions we try, because it's a test and learn mindset. We don't know what will work. We can only try and experiment, right? But if we have the values as our guideposts, it makes it easier to make decisions. We say, oh, what if we try this? And you say, well, no, that will create a situation where, basically this only works for men, because women who have children would be excluded from this. A very simple example is having meetings at 6 o'clock in the evening. We're already redlining. Any woman who has children, we know, often they're the ones picking up the kids from school. So they have troubles participating in meetings after 6 p.m. And so, the values, I think, are really important today. In uncertainty, and in periods of uncertainty, you need something to be able to anchor to, because uncertainty and complexity, even those who embrace it well, I kind of thought Kazi would go in that direction of what are the type of people that embrace uncertainty, and who are the ones that are freaked out by uncertainty. But if everything is uncertain, you can't cope. There's too much anxiety, echo anxiety, existential anxiety, but if you have something that you can anchor on, and I think values is probably one of the best, then it's never easy, but easier to deal with complexity. As a company, what do we stand for? What are we trying to accomplish? Who are the people, the stakeholders that we really care about? That can already help you take decisions or avoid decisions that would hurt the people that you care about, not necessarily solve the problem. So with that, actually, Johan had another comment, and then we can do the segue.
I will try to be brief, and actually, I think I will comment on Geraldo first. I think talk about solutions, that is complexity denial.
I'm sorry, Johan, I'm not hearing very well. The audio is a bit off.
Sorry for that. Talking about solutions, I think is complexity denial, but I think there are two types of root causes. One is the classic reductionistic root cause analysis, right? Oh, here the root cause is, let's fix them and we're done. But there is also this, what caused this symptom, this complex symptom, right? There's some kind of network of root causes that you can't fix, but you can try to understand it. And that's a different root cause. And then I would like to comment on you mentioned that so the executives are paid to make decisions under uncertainty, right? And I think our institutions, including governments, including companies, are built when the world was predominantly complicated. That is shift. Now the world predominantly complicated. And that means that the institutions need to change, and you don't change them by keeping the board structure and replace the individual board.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, basically, a central executive shouldn't make any decisions. You should, in the context where you should, protest, respond. And you need to do that at the edges of the organization, which is basically the lowest rated organization. So how do you build that type of structure? Is to me.
Yeah.
But let's see where you go from here.
Yeah, I mean, Johan, the question, the comment is, you can't change the system from within the system. Is definitely, I wouldn't be the first to say something like that. And, Einstein became famous for that. But, I think there is changes that are possible with changes of governance style. We all have heard about agile and agility, and moving decentralizing the decision making, giving more autonomous decision making to those who are on the edge or customer facing or whatever edge is relevant to your own context. And there are different ways, creating interdisciplinary teams that can make autonomous decisions on equally strategic subjects. Anybody who studies agility and like beyond budgeting, so like the new era of budgeting in an era of complexity. Think about budget and you think about governance, and that's complexity denial. Right away. If you're using annual budgets and you're expected to respect them, you're already denying complexity to a very large extent. So it goes back to boards not accepting that. I've worked and I've done an article actually on ING, their agile transformation. It worked amazingly well from IT to product to cross-disciplinary until it got to the board, and then it broke down because the operational people loved it and it worked really well, and the top governance couldn't get it, and they couldn't work that way. So you may be right, and that's why the fourth turning seems to be a bit scary to me, because it seems like it may be that we need to tear down our institutions, and it's revolution rather than evolution. It's always freaked me out living in France that we're calling it the Fifth Republic because they're waiting for the sixth one to arrive, which usually means that heads have to roll in France for change to happen. But I think you might have just described, on exactly why the fourth turning is so scary, and that people feel that we need to destroy the institutions and start from scratch rather than evolve to newer institutions. Anyway, I'll move on just for brevity's sake, and just share the last few slides. Maybe a few ways forward, some food for thought for dealing with complexity. No, magic bullets, but some ideas. So one, I really love this one. A guy named Kees Dors wrote a book, design thinker based in Australia, called Reframing. And it's like taking the technical diagnosis of problems that most people have and let's try to reframe them in different ways using different metaphors. And so here he gave a really good example of a problem, which was basically a security situation in a bar area in Sydney in which people were beating each up, drunk guys were beating each other up after midnight when the bars closed, and everybody came out drunk at 2 a.m. And so bar fights, right? So what do? It's a security problem. You ask each bar to add a security guard. So what happens then? People start beating up on the security guards. And so what do? Because it's a security problem. Well, more security. So what do? You bring in the police. And then everybody starts beating up on the police. And the problem gets worse. And then it became, the whole area became so insecure, and people started stealing from stores and pillaging, the mini markets, et cetera, et cetera. It spiraled out of control. They brought in this unit called Designing Out Crime, and they said, you know what, this is a complex situation. There's no kind of root cause here, but maybe we can think about this in a different way. You've used a security frame, and that doesn't seem to be working. Let's think about what other frame we could use. And basically, they said, we have a people moving problem here. Maybe we can use a music festival frame and just move people out of the way so that there's no congregation of people at the same time. So there's something we can do legally, and we can stagger the closing times of the restaurants, different time than the bars, different time than the nightclubs, and that already reduces the congestion in the main street. Then what we can do is bring in like shuttle buses to move people around. We can create other activities around the city so that not everything is happening right there. And we can replace the security people by the equivalent of tourist information to help people find the metro, to find an Uber area, et cetera, et cetera. And so no root cause, identified, but rather addressing the complexity and saying what we need is maybe a different metaphor in order to address the issues. And we can take different elements of the issues, and one by one, the combined effect completely reversed the initial situation. And now it's a safe space to be, and even has become like family friendly over time. So that's one approach. Again, it's interesting to have people that are trained in design thinking to do that, but it's not necessary. Beyond that, a subject I mentioned when we were preparing for this session, something I really like is simplexity, and to embracing complexity. I think a big part of our problems are, and in France, I see it a lot, intellectual elites, technology elites, speaking in geek speak, making everything seem very complicated, so that, normal people are impressed by the intelligence of those who are speaking, but don't really understand what they're speaking about. And so really important for me, for leaders, if we go back to values, and your question, Geraldo, earlier, a good leader has to be able to explain the complex simply, which means vulgarization, and it's extracting the essence so that people feel smart rather than stupid in the face of these new technologies, which avoids the Luddite overspill of people turning technology into the enemy, and it allows to give people the feeling that they understand the technologies that are impacting their lives. The second part is to understand that people, and this goes back to Kazi's, your approach of saying neuroscience, neuropsychology, nudging, behavioral, understanding that to be an efficient leader and communicator is to understand that people understand things visually. If I ask you to imagine a music festival in order to address a security situation, it's very easy for you to do. You've all seen a music festival. Maybe some of you have been to one recently. But using metaphors and visuals and letting that do the heavy lifting, like this iceberg metaphor that I've put on the slide, I give the simple tip of the iceberg, even though there's a lot of complexity below the water level. And I give it in a visual where people can easily understand that. The other part is, layering the understanding. Allow people who have a lower grasp of advanced technologies the right layer for them. And then you can layer in a more complex elaboration of the terms you're discussing as you speak to experts. CEOs need a higher level explanation than the geeks. And that layered understanding, which allows all levels to follow, is something that's also important for that, and to not lose the masses on the way to our integration of new technologies. And the other part is kind of this notion of iterative refinement. I do pitching a lot for innovation, and practicing the pitch and practicing how you explain things, having these conversations in-house, in companies, and so that you find the right metaphors, you find the right visuals, you find the things that the people latch onto. You have today generation X, Y, and Z in the workforce. You can't use the same visuals, you can't use the same values, you can't use the same, layered understanding depending on the generation. So you have to try different versions with the different generations until you find one either that works for each generation or one that's universally understood and appreciated. And so I think this complexity is really a key leadership skill as we move forward. And that I don't think enough leaders appreciate that, how important it is for them to speak clearly, even about complex subjects. And just here's a list of practical measures before I finish on another slide, but system thinking's training. I think all of you are probably fans of Peter Senge and the whole notion of systems thinking, system dynamics. It's still too esoteric for too many people, so it's not widely understood. The notion of complexity economics. I don't know if you guys are familiar. There's a book called The Economics of Chaos by Dwyer, which is actually interesting because it's a very high level denial of complexity. Basically saying that with enough data, I can create AI digital twins that can simulate agents, and then we can create a system that can basically predict human behavior and evolution and climate change and all the rest. So it's a very elaborate form of complexity denial, but it can be useful. So I put it in the list, but I find it interesting that people who are so enamored with AI don't really realize that by saying that I can create a model with AI that models humanity is not a form of complexity denial, but actually think that it's for them a solution to complexity, is a bit laughable. But there is a real progress in making things a little bit more predictable and allowing at the simulation level some interesting emerging qualities that can allow us to stress test theoretical crises, which could give us a little bit more insight on how to react to real crises, even though they won't resemble each other. So it can be useful. A lot of money and interesting minds are going in that direction. But again, it's a disguised form of complexity denial. New forms of leadership, adaptive leadership, one that I particularly like from the Harvard Kennedy School, Ron Heffet's School of Thought. There's Theory U from MIT, and the Sharma approach to intuition, sensing, grounding. It's almost kind of like a martial arts thing of bringing in information, crystallizing, and then making the final decision with sensing, like a Tai Chi specialist or martial artist reacting after they have the grounded intuition, which is an interesting model. And there's conscious leadership, another group, forgetting the name of the authors that worked on that. There are several. Another very interesting approach to basically doing what Geraldo said, is giving a value-based approach to leadership that can help us together think about problems and challenges differently. The whole notion of learning organizations, and I'm sure you've seen the immunity change, the developmental training guys who are writing about learning organizations. I think that is another key skill. How do we learn, adapt? And it's a continuous learning voyage that we need to accept to be on. Reskilling, upskilling has to be permanent, and it's not like a once a decade event. The neurodiversity and cross-functionality, inviting neurodiversity into the boardroom, into the classroom, into the corporate operations, the cross-disciplinarity and agile teams, not necessarily agile methods. It's come up with its own limits, I think there, but taking a lot of principles from that can be very interesting. Basically, multiple lenses and plurivocity, multiple voices. The new framework, so the Kunavin we mentioned earlier, but there's also things like futures literacy that can be really interesting. Futures literacy is very interesting, especially when you think about complexity, is that we all react as a projection of our working assumptions, but we never quite try to figure out what are our working assumptions. And if you're at a company like Ericsson, or if you're at any other company or an institution, it's very rare that you kind of sit down and say, all right, what are the working assumptions that we're working on? What are the things that we've all agreed are true, and that's how we operate? Nobody really takes the time to think about that. And that's something that futures literacy actually does. And that's Riel Miller, if anybody wants to look at that literature, Riel Miller. And he developed that within the confines of the UN and UNESCO. The other part, and this is an interesting one, I think, that again, there's the complexity denial here is a big time in corporates. They don't want to deal with warm data and human. So keeping the human in the loop in the decisions, also warm data, which means qualitative data, feedback that can be from informal conversations between customer service and a customer, or a sales rep and a customer, or, I'm kind of hearing this from my customers recently. I don't know, something's going on there. Can't quite name it. That's warm data. And that should be increasingly embraced, captured, and put into the decision loop. And very few companies are doing that. You have companies like Huawei in China who are amazingly good at doing that, of integrating their customers, turning their customers into their fans, and their fans into code developers, etc., and creating a decision loop where their customers are deciding on what's the next development so that they can buy the products of the company. And so it's like it's sold before it's even designed. And then the last one is the mindset, embracing complexity. I think you all know the Ryan Holiday book, The Obstacle is the Way, which is about stoicism. But the complexity is the way is something, again, second law of thermodynamics, the turnings, whatever reason, I think understanding that complexity is inevitable and baked into our reality. And so denying it is useless, and embracing it is probably a pretty interesting way to go. And finally, the last slide I want to leave you with, which I think is maybe the most important, is the framework of rational optimism. I don't even know if it's a framework. I'd say it's a mindset. It's an approach. This is a term coined by Matt Ridley, who wrote a book, The Rational Optimist, and I think another book, How Everything Works, both interesting reads, by the way. But basically, rational optimism does what? It's a mindset that combines a positive outlook with a reliance on empirical evidence, logical reasoning, and basically a knowledge of historical trends. So it's a optimism that's based on reality and not based on naivete or just positive psychology. Oh, we have to be positive. No, it's positive based on something. The rational optimism recognizes potential challenges, but maintains a data-driven belief that solutions can and will be found. And that leads to what? It's not the optimism of don't worry, things will all work out, but it's more grounding the understanding that, listen, human ingenuity, technological and technical progress, as well in economic systems, lead to improvement over time. This is something that history has proven to us again and again. And unlike hope, which is more about a desire for things to improve, often without a clear plan or evidence to back it up, rational optimism says there are good reasons to be hopeful, and let me give you the good and solid reasons why. And so this, to me, is basically my answer to the complexity and uncertainty and meta crisis crises that we may be facing, is to say, listen, what we need, and this is leadership roles across the board need to do this, I believe, is to give people a good and solid reason to be optimistic. Once we lose hope, we're lost. And if the hope is naive, we're just as lost. And what needs to be a tethered form of hope, and this I found in the rational optimism idea. And so the final word before I give you back the microphone is saying, optimism is the one quality more associated with success and happiness than any other. So not only does it make it better for us as a society, but it also it's kind of the secret formula for everyone to live a happy and successful life. Over to you.
What a beautiful ending. We had a comment here on your slide before that. I don't know, who is it that has all the sounds in the background? But
Johan, you can mute, please.
It was on the sorry, the slide before that on the measures that mimicry, biomimicry was maybe also a fit onto that list, or what do you think?
Yeah, a good point. Biomimicry, I would say it's bio-inspired innovation. To make it more precise, but yeah, I think definitely the bio-inspired innovation is something that is very relevant and should be added to the list.
And design, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
First of all, thank you very much, Alon. Mind-blowing session. I think this is one of the topics that are close to your heart, and you showed us really a great session. In summary, for me, probably under your control, Alon, it's new complex context requires new skill sets with the simplicity, with the reframing, with the rational optimism. So this is a call for growth mindset and new learning skills for everyone. A few words. I mean, I discovered the word complexity with Edgar Morin, which is one of the French philosophers who wrote a lot of books about introduction to complexity and a lot about complexity from philosophical perspective. And the point is, the world is complex. Human being is complex. The interconnection are complex, and we're trying to to frame, to try to model everything from a relationship, international relationship, a perspective, from global order, regional order, local order, corporate order, education, human beings, society level, which are a little bit complicated. And a few questions from my side. Two questions, if you don't mind, Alon.
Sure.
First of all, how can we segment complexity? Is there any sub-segments of complexity? This is one thing. And the second thing, how can we, I think from mathematical perspective, there is models for complexity. From physics, for example, perspective, if you take the infinite, small or the infinite big, there are models to model complexity, whatever, the general relativity from Einstein for the bigger things, or Schrödinger for the smaller things. For in genetics, there is complex things, and they try to model things. Why there is no, model that will tackle all the levels, with a framework that will tackle all the levels of complexity from different perspective, that will, we are talking about meta-crisis, which is the link between different crises, and there is one underlying crisis that are underlying the overall crisis. But what about the underlying model that will frame the complexity in a whole?
All right, so tough question. Wouldn't expect anything less from you. So I think the answer was in the question. Yeah, I'll turn it back on you. Like Edgar Morin, his definition of complexity is actions and retroactions, and this like the first visual I showed of like this intricate weaving of influences that is impossible to tease apart. And so him being your, I'd say, intellectual inspiration for this, I think you can understand why most complexity can't be taken apart into subcomponents. So, I'll stay with Israel and Palestine. Is it a religious thing? Is it a territorial thing? Is it a geopolitical thing? Is it a battle about resources? Is it, something else? There's like 100 ways we could take it. And yes, each one could inspire a lot of thinking, but none of them on their own would give us any insight onto how to solve this intractable situation. And so it's a tough one. For me, again, I like visual thinking. I can't remember the name of the author. I don't know if you guys know Gurdjieff, who wrote a lot about spiritual thinking, turn of the century. And he had one of his right-hand man, and I can't remember his name right now, who wrote a book called Tertium Organum. Ouspensky, P.D. Ouspensky. So Ouspensky wrote this book, Tertium Organum, and one of the ways he tries to explain complexity, he says basically, point to any building on your street and try to explain how all of the people who live in that building got there. It's basically, impossible, like to do the, understanding the grandparents who immigrated, who did this, who moved there. It's like just understanding that, simple thing of which people live in a building. It's how far you have to go back to the beginning of humanity in order to explain it. And that's the problem with a lot of most complex situations is you have to go back to the beginning of time to find the root cause, going back to Geraldo's earlier comment. There really is no, but in terms of what you're asking in terms of subcomponents, I think, again, it's interesting to look at different aspects of the problem. I teach innovation, so I tell entrepreneurs, I say, listen, it's not very interesting to innovate for complicated problems because you find the solution, it's 42. And now that you've told the world the solution, anybody can do the same thing. But a complex problem, that's interesting to hack at as an entrepreneur because all you have to do is solve part of the problem. You don't even need to solve the entire situation, just solve part of the problem. And so I'd say the subcomponent approach is maybe just thinking about it in different ways, looking at different lenses, interdisciplinary approaches. Those are always interesting. But again, what happens for the most part is when people start to play that game, they start saying, well, maybe we can reduce the complexity to a series of technical problems that we have solutions for. And then you're just into a very elaborate intellectual game of complexity denial by saying, we can pick it apart and solve it as, one small technical challenge at a time and see, just like consciousness, say it's an emergent quality of neurons. It's not how it works. So again, it can be interesting for the multi-prismic approach, but it doesn't really lead to solving because it is complex. Otherwise, if it is solvable, it's complicated and it wasn't complex and you misdiagnosed in the other direction.
Thank you.
Sure. Geraldo, I think you were next. And then
Yes,
Casimiro.
one thing, I love this slide because it's in this initiative, Alon, one of the many things we are thinking is maybe for the meta crisis we would need a curriculum or maybe it could be a MOOC, a massive open online courses, and do it really big, massive, right? And how would the curriculum look like? And what I generally feel is that people get very dogmatic and start just thinking of one thing, theory U or whatever, and then this becomes like the silver bullet, right? While I think you have to have all these frameworks. And in the chat, we have a lot of other things. One thing that you work a lot, like network analysis. I think is really great to see connections and paths and so. But my question to you then is, we had a debate in our community during the week and about, I think it was one person that wrote, why there are so many idiots. The word.
I
And I don't
agree.
know.
I'm suffering from that.
And I know it really hit a nerve because I had written around that 3 different blog posts along the years. And at the same time, the difficulty I have that, let's say, people often say, if you can't explain to the CU in the elevator 1 minute what you're dealing with around your project or idea, then it's no idea. Okay, and that's the problem. In 1999, I was working with a project on sustainability in a time when a lot of the management thought it was just volcano activities, volcano, right? In a time that we like to travel a lot. And how can you explain such a difficult challenge in just 1 minute? Because then you're getting these oversimplifications, right? Having said that, I think the problem we have today is that we have the Trumps and so the Millets and Bolsonaros that can really oversimplify things and really polarize things. And while you have very good people like Daniel Schwarzenberger on Metacries or Greta Thunberg, you name it, that have difficult telling an opportunity-driven narrative. We discussed John Hagel, right? And in that sense, then we already lost the war, right? So basically, I think my question is, I have this dilemma. I mean, how, because the point of Pascal was, he was really angered of this issue we have at companies that everything needs to be so simple and so, right? But I think, I guess it's the central thing here is the narrative, how we must be much better. I don't know. I'm trying to,
Yeah.
I hope I'm very unstructured here, but I hope you understand the sentiment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is definitely, the COVID-19 was seen as the pandemic that was doing the most damage to humanity. For me, it's stupidity. There is definitely a pandemic of stupidity. And there's actually a good book written by an Italian on that, of how how it really is viral, and how the impact of those who don't think on those who think is very painful. The other one is, there's a great quote, and I can't remember who said it, but it was, all wisdom is plagiarism, only stupidity is original. And so that summarizes my thinking on stupidity, but that was one of my favorite citations. Yeah, it's a tough one, because there's 2 types of stupidity. There's the stupidity of the masses, that don't care enough, or today that, there's the dearth of focus and concentration, where people don't read anything, they scroll, which is like a mindless skimming. So people don't really absorb any information. Information today, the narratives can be reassembled with, fake news. And the way the media now is structured, it's Twitter bites and the headlines, and most of it is very misleading, if not worse. You have Elon Musk that you mentioned earlier, who is, he's the head of the leading media, I'd say, in the world that most journalists use, which is X. And, it's like straight out of a Marvel comic book, to have an evil sociopath running the world. And, Terminator was about Skynet, which was a satellite company that was, basically controlling the world with robots. It's like we're back in the movie. We all saw the movie. That's no secret, but it's where we've literally recreated the conditions of a nightmarish scenario. It was just, I posted recently on LinkedIn, Musk controls 2/3 of the satellites that are around the world right now. And probably next year, he will be offering internet service that most of the people on the planet will opt into. And so, he will be the telecom operator, the social media operator, and everything else, and the wealthiest human on the planet at the same time. So there's the savant idiots, the idiot savants, and just the masses, and all three are conspiring together, and it's very painful to see. And I really don't know how to address that, but I'm definitely suffering from that and seeing it just so often. And it's quite scary. It's to the point where, immigrants in the United States are, recent immigrants are voting for Trump for all the wrong reasons. And you're like, how is that possible? Blacks and Hispanics, even, Christians, are voting for this guy who is against everything they stand for, and yet they still will vote for him. For me, it's incomprehensible. Sorry, I slewed away from the complexity, but it is a complex problem, and I don't know how to solve it. And I agree, it is a real issue. We're more educated than ever, and we're stupider than ever. I don't know how that happened conjointly.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, Casimiro, it's a bit long.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
No, it's just first of all, thank you, because we are staying longer than what was expected for the meeting. So I don't know if you have a hard stop to agree on. If you can stay still for a little bit longer, there has been a very good discussion in the chat with various different comments, questions, a lot of very positive comments about that slide. About like curriculum and next ways of working, and perhaps some additions to that. And there were a couple of very interesting questions that perhaps we can close with those ones, which have to do with, based on what you have said, yes, it seems that complexity is like a natural path towards somewhere until there's a creative destruction or something like that, that goes or allows for something easier. But there was a good thread of discussion about, but do we need and do we want that type of complexity, and what can we do to do about it? Is innovation and technology needed? Is it good for accepting certain level of complexity or hiding it? Or do we wait until it explodes and then we have to start from scratch?
Well, so I did a different master class a couple of weeks ago on exponential business model innovation. And one of the things is that there is, a bevy of recent technological advances that are happening at the same time. And each one is highly disruptive in potential and complexity generating in and of its own. But the convergence of these technologies is very exciting for the emergence of possibilities. It's like we deny complexity, but we're really happy to see AlphaFold win the Nobel Prize, because they're going to help us discover new candidates for molecules for immunotherapy that can help cure us from the diseases. With the immune system is probably one of the most complex systems on the planet, the human immune system. And so, we live thanks to this complexity, literally. And so the question, it's an interesting discussion, but we don't really have a choice. Humanity has been on a curve of accelerating technological progress, and we're on the curve. There's no way to jump off that curve. And so, it's nice to be able, it's a privilege to be able to talk about it, but we don't have the privilege to choose to get off that train. And again, like we can get off the train, and I think in Europe we're trying to, but that won't stop China or the US from staying on those same train tracks. And so all it is just saying, well, if we choose to take a step aside, it doesn't change society. It just means that we will be irrelevant in the discussions on which technologies humanity will adopt, because we decided to take a step aside. And so, again, another complex question, but like in Europe, the at least until very recent, I'd say until the EV tariffs on China were imposed a few weeks ago, until now, the modus operandi of the European Union was regulation in order to protect the consumer. And only with the EVs for China did they change to protecting the producer, which was it was a massive change in philosophy. Nobody really commented it, but for me it was a really major chip. And we've been trying to protect the consumer. And for example, our GPRD and the other kind of data confidentiality ideas are great in principle, but if you're a small European company and I ask you to accept that I keep your data, you're going to say no, because who are you, little European company? But if I'm Google, if I'm Microsoft, if I'm Apple, of course you're going to say yes, because they're vital to your daily operations. And so by wanting to protect the consumer and the small company, they've created a system that's biased towards the bigger companies. And so, unintended consequences. And I think that was a form of complexity denial, of saying all we have to do is ask people before if they want to opt in for data sharing, and we'll neutralize the power of the big boys. And they didn't realize that it's more complex than that. And so I think that's a good form of complexity denial, but also a question of just kind of like Geraldo's, very, wise comment on root causes, like if we take it to the Japanese approach of the 5 whys of digging deep into what's going on, that you can accept with complexity. But trying to find a root cause is a form of complexity denial. Trying to say, do we want this technology emergence or not, is a form of complexity denial. It's like, what are we going to do with this acceleration of technology? How can we embrace it, harness it, leverage it, or deviate it so that it's positive and in line with European values? Going back to the guidepost of values, that it protects the consumers, it protects the little guy. And so, interesting question in theory, but in practice, it's another form of complexity denial, and we all fall into the trap. It's nothing silly. It's, I think, a natural human tendency to want to be able to control a little bit what goes on in your life.
Alon, I think on behalf of everyone here, such an excellent walkthrough. Well done with the complexity Sherpa.
Thank you.
Or complexity Sherpa. And also, I rarely get to see a presentation where a person just also happens to drop like 10 good books that you have to read afterwards. So that's very impressive and also very kind of you to share those as well. And I really hope that we get to talk more within this context. I'll also email you privately regarding maybe another type of discussion. But again, I'm so grateful that you presented this to us. And now a lot of people is entering my room here, so I better mute myself. But again, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for the kind words, Peter.
Yeah.
Now, just let me add that really appreciate and warm welcome I hope you're joining this community. I mean, you should see the chat so we can continue these conversations. Would be great. So we'll be sending a small invitation, a teaser for you, right, Johan?
Yeah.
Yes. Good.
Thank you so much, guys.
And I would say
thank
the
you
same
for challenging.
I would say the same for May Ann, if she wants to join us as well, because this is a very open community, and we will share with you some guidelines on how we work. But going back to what Geraldo was saying, Alon, thank you so much. It has been really fascinating. Thank you very much.
With pleasure. Geraldo, I'll send you the slides as well.
Sure.
Thank
you
you.
all.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very
Have a
much,
great evening.
Alon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.